Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is part 6 in a video series where I'm attempting to explain every Sudoku solve technique. In parts 1 through 5, we covered basic techniques, advanced groups, fish, single-digit chains, and multi-digit chains, respectively. So make sure to go check those out. Those will all be linked in the description. And you'll especially want to see the last two on single-digit chains and multi-digit chains specifically in order to kind of understand the content in this video. So anyway, in the last video on wings and multi-digit chains, we discussed a lot of short AICs and categorized them so that we can recognize them and recognize what eliminations we can make when we see them. But in a lot of puzzles, you're not going to have those short AICs available, and you have to resort to more advanced techniques. And this involves making assumptions about certain candidates so you can force a contradiction. And sometimes these assumptions will loop back around on themselves and come full circle. And sometimes these assumptions will branch out into a whole net of interdependent chains. So we're going to cover those forcing chains, loops, and nets in this video. So let's get into it. Just like the previous two parts, we're still going to be building our chains using strong and weak links, but unlike the previous parts, we're going to go beyond some of the AIC logic we've stuck to so closely thus far. So just to get into a couple definitions before we start, forcing chains are technically just any chains that force a contradiction. But typically we only use this term when we're talking about chains where we assume a starting point and look at the implications to see if that causes any contradictions. Since we assume our starting point is true, we could actually start off our chains on a weak link, and then we could propagate from strong to weak as we would usually. So here's an example of a simple forcing chain from the Sudoku Coach campaign chapter on forcing chains. And as you can see, the way this is structured really doesn't look like an AIC. Um, and we'll go over why that is a little bit more once we actually get into forcing chains. Loops are essentially any chains that start and end on the same candidate in the same cell, so they form a closed loop. And this can happen when we are exploring the implications of one assumption and it ends up circling back to our original cell, or it can happen when we are looking at two different chains starting from the same place and then they end up ending in the same place. The point is, it forms a closed loop. And here's another example. This is also from the Sudoku Coach campaign. And you can see this is a completely closed loop that this chain shows here. And then finally, nets are what happens when we have a chain that splits up into multiple other chains. And importantly, those chains do have to recombine at some point to force a certain implication. And then the chain continues from that implication. And here we have another example from the Sudoku Coach campaign. As you could probably tell, these forcing nets can get really complicated really quickly. But let's get into each of these techniques in a little bit more detail. A Nishio forcing chain is a chain that starts with an assumption about the state of a certain candidate, and then you look at the implications of that chain. So basically, you guess whether a candidate is going to be true or false, and then you see what happens. And if down the line you run into a contradiction, then you know your initial assumption was wrong. So there's a lot of ways you could get a contradiction. Either you could have one candidate, not necessarily your initial candidate, but it can be any candidate, is both simultaneously true and false. That's one contradiction. You could have a cell being emptied of candidates, a cell having multiple candidates being true at the same time, a house having multiple different candidates being true, or a house being emptied of a certain candidate. Those are all contradictions that would basically be impossible in a Sudoku. So let's go back to this grid that we had in the Sudoku Coach campaign, the lesson on forcing chains, the one that we just showed in the intro section. And let's take a look at what would happen if we assume this 3 was true. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that in green. Well, we know this 3 is weakly linked to this 2. And this 2 is bilocal in its column. So it is strongly linked to this 2 down here. So if this 3 is true, this means this 2 also has to be true. So I'll go ahead and mark that in green. But we also know this 3 is weakly linked to this 3 right here. And that 3 is strongly linked to this 8. So if this 3 is true, this 8 also must be true. And you might see there's a problem here because both this 2 and this 8 see this cell which only contains a 2 and an 8. So if this 3 were true, it would essentially empty out this cell of all of its candidates, and that is a contradiction. So we can go back to our initial assumption of 3 and say that it is false, and therefore we can go ahead and eliminate that 3. And that's basically how we do Nishio forcing chains. Now you may be wondering, how did we come to assume this 3 was true? It's basically just a guess, but we can look at the fact that it's connected to these two strong links. And that can be an indicator that there might be something interesting going on there. Here we have another example of a Nishio forcing chain in this grid. This is from the Sudoku wiki page on Nishio forcing chains. Let's go ahead and look at these bottom 3 boxes, and let's specifically take a look at the 6s in them. So right off the bat, it doesn't look like there's a ton of strong links, unless if we approach it from the perspective of group links, and then we could actually see there are a couple strong links here. First of all, there is a strong link between this group of 2 6s and this individual 6 right here. And then we could also see there's a strong link between this group of 2 6s and then this individual 6 right here. And you might see that both of these groups see this 6 right here. So they're both weakly linked to this 6. So let's go ahead and take a look at what would happen if this 6 was true. So let's go ahead and mark that. Well, we would know both of these groups would have to be false because of the weak link, and therefore that would make both of these strongly linked 6s true. Let's go ahead and take a look at this cell. We know this 6 is weakly linked to this 2, but this 2 is strongly linked to this other 2, which is bilocal in the box. And you'll notice this 2 is weakly linked to this 2 right here, which is then strongly linked to this 2. So if this 6 right here is true, this 2 must be true, and therefore that makes this 2 true as well. So you'll notice that in this cell right here, both this 2 and this 6 have to be true at the same time, based on our initial assumption. Therefore, we could say our initial assumption of this 6 being true was wrong, and therefore we could eliminate that 6. So that is how you do Nishio forcing chains. So much like Nishio forcing chains, digit forcing chains also look at the implications based on the state of a certain candidate. However, instead of just looking at whether if the candidate is false or if the candidate is true, digit forcing chains look at both outcomes, and instead of using that to make assumptions about our initial candidate, it uses that to make conclusions about any other candidates that stay the same. So let me show you all an example of how that works. This is a grid from the Sudoku wiki, and what we're going to do here is we're going to start out in the bottom right corner with this 5. So first, let's go ahead and make the assumption that this 5 is true. So what would happen if that was the case? Well, first of all, we know this 5 is weakly linked to this 2 right here. So if this 5 were true, this 2 would if this 5 were true, this 2 would be false. And we could see this 2 is strongly linked to this 2 up here. So if this 5 were true, this 2 would also be true. I want to go ahead and highlight that in green. So any candidates that are true in our first true chain are going to be highlighted in green. So this 2 is weakly linked to this 6. And then we could see the 6 is bilocal in its column. So if this 6 is false, this 6 must be true. Let's go ahead and stop there for now. So we know from our true chain that if this 5 were to be true, both this 2 and this 6 would be true. Okay, now let's look at the other side. Let's look at what if this 5 was false? Well, let's see if this 5 has any strong links, first of all. And we could see that this 5 has a strong link with this bilocal 5 in the same box. So if this 5 were false, this 5 would be true. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight that in red. Any candidates that are true in our false chain are going to be highlighted in red here. And we could say that this 5 is weakly linked to this 5 right here, which is then strongly linked to this 5, which is bilocal in the column. So if this 5 is true, this 5 must also be true. So I want to go ahead and also highlight that in red. And we can see that this 5 is weakly linked to this 5, which is then strongly linked to this 8. So our 8 must also be true in this false chain. And then this 8 is weakly linked to this 8, which is then strongly linked to this pair of 8s, which is bilocal in the row. Um, so this 8 must also be true. Then we could say it is weakly linked to this 6. And then finally, we could say this 6 is strongly linked to this 6, which is bilocal in its column. So from all that, we can conclude that if our initial 5 is true, this 6 is going to be true. And if our initial 5 is false, this 6 is going to be true. Either way, these 3 6s are going to be false. So digit forcing chains are one of 3 techniques that are called verity forcing chains, where we take a certain a certain set of implications that is going to be true no matter what. For example, a digit being either true or false, that covers all of the space of what that digit could be. So we take that verity and we look at what stays the same across that space of possible outcomes. And in this case, no matter if our initial 5 is true or false, those 6s will have to be false. Therefore, we could eliminate them because they're not going to matter either way. So the nice thing about digit forcing chains, as compared to other verity forcing chains, is because we're only looking at 2 conditions, true or false, we only ever have to look at 2 chains. Self-forcing chains are another type of verity forcing chain, where we look at all the possible candidates in the cell and see what the implications are for each of them. Since we know that at least one candidate in the cell has to be true, if there are any outcomes that stay consistent across all the candidates in the cell, we know those outcomes have to be valid. So here we have an example from the Sudoku wiki page on self-forcing chains. And we're going to go ahead and start off with this cell, which only has 2 candidates, 8 and 9. So we'll only have to look at 2 chains. One is assuming 8 is true, one is assuming 9 is true. So let's go ahead and start with 8. We could see that our 8 is weakly linked to this 8 right here, which is then strongly linked to this 2. And then this 2 is weakly linked to this 2, which is then strongly linked to this 3. And then this 3 is weakly linked to this 3 right here. So we know that if this 8 was to be true, then this 2 would have to be true. This 3 would have to be true. And then finally, this 3 right here would be false. So those green numbers are going to be our kind of 8 chain. So this is what it looks like if our 8 is true. Now let's look at what happens if our 9 is true. So we could say our 9 here is weakly linked to this 9 right here. And this 9 is strongly linked to this 9 right here, which is then weakly linked to this 3. So if our 9 is true, and we're going to go ahead and highlight these in red, this 9 must also be true. So we could see in either instance, whether 8 or our 9 is true, that this 3 here is going to be false. So we can go ahead and eliminate that 3. Because no matter what candidate is in this cell right here, we're going to come to the same conclusion where this 3 is going to be false. So that is the self-forcing chain. So region forcing chains, which are sometimes called unit forcing chains, is when we look at every possible location of a digit in its house. Since we know that each house has to contain each digit exactly once, we know that one of these locations has to be true. And therefore, anything that stays consistent across all of the possible locations of that digit must be a valid conclusion. So let's go ahead and take a look at this grid. This is from the Sudoku wiki. And let's go ahead and look at our 5s in this bottom right box we have here. So we have 3 5s in this box. So one of these 5s must be true. And we're going to build a chain for each of these 3 5s. So first, let's start with this 5 right here. We know that this 5, if it is true, it's going to be weakly linked to this 5, which is then strongly linked to this 9, which is then weakly linked to this 9. So if this 5 is true, this 9 is also going to be true. And we're going to go ahead and highlight that chain in green there. Next, let's look at this 5. If this 5 is true, well, we know this 8 must be false because this 5 is weakly linked to this 8. And this 8 is strongly linked to this 8, which is bilocal in the column. So this 8 must be true. So I'm going to highlight the 5 and the 8 in red here. And if this 8 is true, this 8 here must be false. And we could see this 8 is bilocal in the row with this 8 over here. And it is strongly linked to this 8. So this 8 must be true. And this 8 is weakly linked to this 9 right here. And then finally, let's take a look at this 5 in our top right of the box. We know that if this 5 is true, and we're going to go ahead and highlight this 5 in yellow, this 9 must be false because of the weak link. And we can see this 9 is bilocal in its column. So if this 9 is false, this 9 must be true. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that in yellow. And we can see this 9 is weakly linked to this 9 where all of our other chains end. So we could see that with all three of our chains, this 9, which you can hardly see it because it's being covered by an arrow now, but this 9 has to be false because each of our three chains separately concluded that this 9 would be false. Our first chain showed that this 9 would be true. Our second chain showed that this 8 would be the candidate in the cell instead of the 9. And then our final chain showed that this 9 would be true, which of course would make this 9 false. So we can go ahead and eliminate that 9. And in general, for both region forcing chains and cell forcing chains, we want to look for possibilities where we don't have to look at that many chains. So typically when we have to compare more than 3 chains, it's not really worth it. So for region forcing chains, we really want to look at bilocal or trilocal candidates. And for cell forcing chains, we really want to focus on bivalue or trivalue cells because we don't want to have to compare too many chains at once. It takes more work and it's less likely to result in an elimination. But anyway, though that is region forcing chains, and that sums up verity forcing chains. So you might have noticed that a lot of our chains are starting and ending in around the same locations. And while this kind of makes our grid look a little bit cluttered, this can actually be a really good thing because if we could link our chains together in the right way, instead of having to analyze multiple different chains and keep track of them at the same time, we could actually form them into a single loop and make eliminations based on the structure of that loop itself. So here we have a grid from the Sudoku wiki, and let's go ahead and look at this cell with a 5 and an 8. And let's say I'm trying to do a digit forcing chain using this 5. So let's say that this 5 is true. What does that chain look like? Well, we could say that this 5 is weakly linked to this 5, which is strongly linked to this 4, and that would be our true chain. And then as far as our false chain, if this 5 is false, then this 8 will be true. And then this 8 is weakly linked to this 8 right here, which is then strongly linked to this 8, which is weakly linked to this 4, which is then strongly linked to this 4. So from our digit forcing chain, if 5 is false, then this 4 is going to be true. I'll just highlight that in blue. And if 5 is true, then this 4 is going to be true. So either way, this 4 is a peer of both those 4s. So we could eliminate it. And before I actually remove it from the board, I'm just going to go ahead and highlight it as red. I'm marking it for elimination there. So that's one way we could do our chain. But if we just extend our true chain a little bit and move back our false chain a little bit, we could actually get a completely different elimination. So let's go ahead and get rid of these highlighted 4s here and move back our false subchain a little bit. So going from our true chain, this 4 would have to be true, which would make this 4 false, which would make this 4 true. And you kind of can't see it because behind our red arrow here, but there is a 5 behind this arrow. And from what we could see in our false chain, the 4 in this cell would be true, and in our true chain, the 8 in this cell would be true. So either way, a 5 cannot be true in this case. So we are going to go ahead and mark that as a candidate for elimination. Now, what would happen if we extended our true chain even further and moved our false chain back even more? Well, what we could say is that this 4 is weakly linked to this 8, and then this 8 is strongly linked to this 8. So our true chain says that this 8's true, and our false chain says that this 8's true. So either way, this 8 cannot be true. Now, by a similar logic, we could even go back and create a really long false chain and use that to prove that the 5 in this cell can also be eliminated. Now, you may be thinking, it's cool that we have a lot of eliminations from this really the same digit forcing chains, but it sure takes a lot of work to actually construct each of those chains separately to make those eliminations. So what we could do instead is we could actually just form this into a single closed loop. Let's say if all I have to do is take these two eights and draw a weak link between them, and then that actually completely closes our loop. And what we could do even is we can get rid of all these arrows, because once we have a loop, it doesn't really matter what direction we go in. So this is what it looks like when we form our loop, and you'll notice that it perfectly alternates between strong and weak links. And this is possible because we have an even number of nodes. So when this happens, it is called a continuous loop. And with continuous loops, we could say that any candidate that sees two nodes on a loop can be eliminated. So for example, this 5 sees both this 5, which comprises one node in the loop, and this 5, which comprises another node in the loop. Therefore, we can go ahead and eliminate it. Same thing for this 4 and this 8. And with this 5, it sees both the 4 and the 8 in the same cell, and therefore we could eliminate that 5 because it sees those two nodes in our loop. And the reason this works is because whenever you see two different nodes, what that's saying is that you are seeing two different ends of our implications based on that digit forcing chain for really any of these digits. So instead of looking at multiple different digit forcing chains, what we could do is create one loop, and that allows us to eliminate all those candidates much easier. So we've looked at what happens when we have an even number of nodes in a loop where a continuous loop where we perfectly alternate between strong and weak links. But what happens if we have an odd number of nodes? Well, this essentially forces us to have a discontinuity in our loop. Either we're going to have two weak links that are adjacent or two strong links that are adjacent. And if this is the case, instead of making conclusions about candidates that are off the loop, we have to make a conclusion about the candidate at the discontinuity itself. So here we have another grid from the Sudoku wiki, and we're going to go ahead and start with the 5 in this cell. So we could say that this 5 is weakly linked to this 5, which is strongly linked to the 7, which is weakly linked to the 7, which is strongly linked to the 7, which is weakly linked to the 7, which is strongly linked to this 5. And so far, it looks like we are alternating properly until we want to go back to original 5 here. And we actually see that if we go back to original 5, we have an odd number of nodes. And in this case, going back to original 5, that is a weak link because these 5s are not bilocal, so it can't be a strong link. And this essentially means that our 5 is at a discontinuity between two weak links in our loop here. What that means is that we could actually eliminate this 5. Whenever we have a discontinuity that's sandwiched between two weak links, we could eliminate that discontinuity. And we could actually prove this through a Nishio forcing chain, why this works. So let's assume that this 5 was to be true. If this 5 was true, then that would mean this 5 would be false, which would make this 7 true. I want to go ahead and mark that in blue, which would make this 7 false, which would make this 7 true, which would make this 7 false, which would make this 5 true. But at the same time, this initial 5 would be true, which would make this 5 false. So this 5 can't simultaneously be true and false. Therefore, we know that our initial assumption of this being a 5 is not true. So we could actually demonstrate through a Nishio forcing chain why these discontinuous nice loops, whenever we have two adjacent weak links, we have to eliminate the candidate. Similarly, we could actually demonstrate when we have two adjacent strong links, we force the candidate to be true in that cell. Here we have another grid from the Sudoku wiki, and we're going to go ahead and start in this cell with our 9. So we could see that our 9 here is strongly linked to this 9, which is then weakly linked to this 5, which is strongly linked to this 5, which is weakly linked to this 5, strongly linked to this 8, which is weakly linked to this 8, which is strongly linked to this 8, which is weakly linked to this 9. And then we could see we have a discontinuity here because we have an odd number of nodes. These two 9s are strongly linked. So we could see here that this 9 is at our discontinuity. And therefore, since it is between two strong links, it must be true. And let's go ahead and prove this with a Nishio forcing chain. If we were to assume this 9 was false, then this 9 would be true. This 5 would be true. This 8 would be true. And this 8 would be true, which would then prove that our initial 9 is true, because then we would be eliminating this 9, which is strongly linked to our original 9. So if we assume our initial 9 is false, we end up coming back with the implication that it's true, which means that initial assumption of falsehood is wrong. Therefore, this 9 must be true, and we could actually go ahead and fill in a 9 in that cell. So in summary, with discontinuous loops, if we're between two weak links, we could eliminate that candidate. If we're between two strong links, we could make that candidate true. So one of the cool things about loops is that they could pretty much entirely be folded into traditional AIC logic. So in addition to type 1 AICs, where the starting and ending candidates have to be the same, and type 2 AICs, where the starting and ending cells have to be able to see each other, continuous loops can kind of be thought about as type 3 AICs, where both of those conditions are met. We start and end on the same candidate in cells that could see each other, allowing us to weakly link those cells. And if we start and end on a strong link, and then weakly linked our start and end, that allows us to form a perfect continuous loop. And we could actually demonstrate that. We're going to go back to the continuous loop we talked about the section before last here. And we could actually demonstrate that pretty easily by removing any of these weak links. Let's say, for example, we remove this weak link between the 4s. We could actually just see this as being an example of an AIC. We start on the strong link with this 4, and then we move it all the way over to the strong link, and then we end on the strong link on this 4. So it starts and ends in a strong link. Therefore, anything that sees both of those 4s can be eliminated. And that's how we would justify the elimination of this 4. But we could just as easily say the same thing about removing this strong link between these two 5s. We could say this is another AIC that would start on this strong link and end on this strong link. And this 5 sees both ends of that AIC. So really, continuous loops are just when you overlap multiple different AICs, and that allows them to form a closed loop. Since continuous loops can be classified as AIC, they could also be named and categorized very similarly to the AIC wings that we discussed in the last part, except they're called rings instead of wings. So this is a grid from the Sudoku subreddit wiki, and you can see it's a continuous loop where we have one V-link and two L strong links. So if you remember from the wings video, VLL is an M wing. So this would be called an M ring. Now, the only kind of difference to be aware of when it comes to classifying different types of rings is you could technically read it from any direction. So there wouldn't really be a difference between VLL strong link structure versus like an LVL. For example, if you started at this 9, it would be LVL, or even LLV if you started at this group of 5s right here. So you really also have to pay attention to the weak link structure as well when you're classifying these as different types of rings. Discontinuous loops can also be classified under AIC, but they're a lot more trivial. So take this weak loop that we went over, for example. If we were to simply ignore these two adjacent weak links, we would just be left with a regular old AIC. So this specific one would be a W wing, actually. And in this case, this 5 sees both ends of the AIC, so it could be eliminated. So nothing too interesting there. With strong discontinuous loops, the relationship with AIC isn't quite as obvious, but it's still relatively trivial. So going back to our strong discontinuous loop here, what we want to do is instead of removing both of our strong links at the discontinuity, we want to remove one of the strong links at the discontinuity and its adjacent weak link. That's the only way we can start and end our AIC on strong links. So let's go ahead and remove this one, for example, although we could equivalently remove the strong and weak link on this 9 as well. So this just forms a regular AIC, and the elimination we would make would be this 9. After all, we start on a 9 in this cell, and then which means we could remove the 9 from our ending cell. The problem is, if we remove this 9 that was strongly linked to our original 9, then by the rules of it being a strong link, that would force our original 9 to be true. So the conclusion we draw for discontinuous strong loops, that the candidate that the discontinuity has to be true, is simply a second order effect of what a regular AIC elimination would get you anyways. So overall, all of the loop techniques can really be folded into AIC logic. So we've seen what it looks like to keep track of multiple chains at the same time when it comes to verity forcing chains. And if we're lucky, sometimes these verity chains will overlap and allow us to create a single closed loop, which really simplifies things. But sometimes we have to actually branch off our chains in the middle of an existing chain. And we could branch it either because we need to make an additional assumption or just because we want to explore two implications that go in completely opposite directions. So whenever we do this, it's called a forcing net or interchangeably a dynamic forcing chain. And in order to kind of demonstrate how this works, we're actually going to return to that grid from Sudoku Coach, the really scary web of all sorts of lines that we saw at the beginning. And we're going to go ahead and break that down step by step to kind of demystify it a little bit. So we're actually going to start here with this cell that has a 3 and a 7. And if the 3 was true here, that would make this 3 false. And if the 7 was true, or if the 3 was false, after all, they are strongly linked, then it would make this 7 true. This 7 would make this 7 false, which would make this 7 true because of the strong link. And then here's actually where we're going to branch off into two different subchains. One of these chains, we're going to go down. So this 7 is weakly linked to this 3, and this 3 is strongly linked to this 3. So that is our subchain that's going to go down here. And then we're going to have another chain that goes, a subchain that goes to the right. So this 7 is weakly linked to this 7, which is strongly linked to this 4. Now, there's not much we could do going from this 4. It's not weakly linked to any other strong links. So let's go back to our subchain that went down and see if maybe there's some kind of conclusion we could draw from this subchain that allow it to link up with our other subchain. So we could say this 3 is weakly linked to this 3, which is then strongly linked to this 3. So we're getting kind of in the same vicinity of our first subchain that went to the right. This 3 is weakly linked to this 8, which is strongly linked to this 8, which is weakly linked to this 4. And now we're getting somewhere because we could say this 4 is weakly linked to this 4. And we could actually join up our two subchains here because we've eliminated two of the 4s in this box. So by eliminating both those 4s, we could essentially draw a group strong link between these two 4s and this 4 right here. So we know this 4 is going to be true, which is going to make this 7 false. And it is also going to make this 4 false. So we could also look back to our beginning cell here and say this 7 is going to make this 7 false. So if we know our 4 is false from this long kind of subchain that we did here, and our 7 is false from right from the beginning, then we know our 9 must be true here. And we also know that if this 7 is false and this 7 is false, this 7 here must be true. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight this 9 and this 7 in green. And both of them are weakly linked to this cell, which make this 7 and this 9 false, which finally makes this 3 true. So if this 3 is true, this 3 in our top left can't be true. And if this 3 is false, then we can go over our forcing net here, where we break up and recombine, and we could actually conclude that this 3 is going to be true. So either way, this 3 in our top left is going to be false, therefore we can eliminate it. So that was a lot of work just to make a single elimination, which is why forcing nets are seen as a technique of last resort. You really don't want to use them just because they are so much work to do. And if you don't already know the path going in, it takes a lot longer than what we just did right here. So if you could find any other technique to make that same conclusion, it's better to go with that technique. But sometimes you do have to resort to doing forcing nets. And when you do this, there's kind of two general approaches to actually looking through those nets. There's the breadth first approach, which is when you branch off into two subchains. You dig a little bit into each chain um, before you move on to the next step. So, for example, when I branched out into this chain that goes to the right and this chain that goes down, um, I dug a little bit into each one. So I dug into the fact that this would go to a 4, and I dug into the fact that this would go to this 3. And then that kind of allowed me to realize that I wanted this chain, this subchain that went down, to somehow reconnect with this 4. So when you're doing a breadth first approach, you have to keep track of multiple chains at the same time. But sometimes having that nice bird's eye view can allow you to guide where you want each subchain to go in order to get those subchains to meet up. So the other way of doing it is a depth first approach, where you go really deep into each subchain separately and force it to a point where it doesn't work, and then you go back and look at the other subchain. So this way of doing things is also sometimes called Ariadne's thread, after the ancient Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. So in the myth, the Minotaur, which is this big guy with a bull head, is trapped in this really intricate maze called the Labyrinth, and Theseus needs to go in and kill the Minotaur. But he doesn't want to get trapped in the labyrinth. So the king's daughter gives him a ball of yarn, and what Theseus does is he ties that yarn at the entrance to the labyrinth, and as he goes through, he unfurls the ball of yarn. So whenever he gets lost or reaches a dead end, he could follow that yarn back to the beginning, or at least back to a point where he's familiar with, and then try a different path. And that is exactly what we're doing when we do these forcing nets. We take an implication, we follow it to a point where it stops working, and then we go back and try a different path. So it just goes to show that even though this whole thing looks really complicated with all the different lines going everywhere, this kind of logic actually dates back to ancient history. And it really is just structured trial and error. And with that, we conclude this part on forcing chains, loops, and nets. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like. We will be continuing the series. The next part's going to go over coloring techniques. So make sure to subscribe if you want to stay tuned.